Okay, enough. Don't listen to this guy. Everything's conspiracies with him. Not conspiracies. Conspiracy. Singular. Reaching back to ancient Egypt, there's been a single cabal of powerful individuals directing the course of human history. But the common man prefers to believe they don't exist, which aids their success.
Global warming, military upheavals in the third world, actors elected to public office.
The spread of coffee bars, germs outpacing antibiotics, and boy bands? Come on. What gained from all this? Who indeed?
What is
Hey, what's up, fellow slaves? So, over the last few months, both the Soulless talking heads on the left and the Soulless talking heads on the right have been pushing this lab leak theory narrative. So I figured I'd make a quick video pointing out the obvious reasons as to why. So, to begin with, this lab leak theory has always been part of their narrative. It's the narrative the controlled opposition pushes because it's a narrative that pushes the same general idea that there is a novel coronavirus. And it's a brilliant narrative because even those who don't subscribe to this lab leak theory are made to believe that this virus is so new, so deadly, so unnatural and novel that some people can be led to believe it came from a lab. This sets up a classic heads they win, tails we lose scenario, where in either case, there is a big scary virus out there, and the lockdowns were at least partially justified. Now, before I go any further into my argument and explain why I believe they're pushing this lab leak theory now, as opposed to pushing it like a year ago, before I discuss that, I want to quickly discuss Brian's stance over at High Impact Commercials, because Brian presents a very similar argument to my own, but Brian backs his argument up with some very, very questionable information. And Brian has been spouting this questionable information for like over a year now. So, in this video of Brian's, Brian rightfully criticizes Steven Crowder and this other conservative talking head who I've never heard about before for playing along with what Jon Stewart said on Stephen Colbert's show. So, I'm sure everyone knows Jon Stewart was on Stephen Colbert's show. They had this obviously scripted performance that was obviously rehearsed. And then you had all the conservatives on the right saying, oh, look, Jon Stewart, he's finally coming out and he's backing the lab leak theory. And then they say, oh, look, Stephen Colbert, he seems so awkward. He seemed like he was caught off guard. And these conservatives are making it as if this was like an authentic or original or natural interaction between Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. So in Brian's video, he criticizes them. And then he backs his argument up with this CDC document and this CBS video. And essentially, in this CDC document is about the PCR test. And on page 42 of this document, the document begins to discuss how the test was calibrated to test for COVID-19. And on this page, the document says that because no COVID-19 isolates were available to the CDC at the time the test was created, the test was calibrated using RNA from coronaviruses that the CDC already had in stock. They say they use like stock RNA of coronavirus or of coronaviruses. Not the specific COVID-19 coronavirus, but other coronaviruses that they had in stock. I just have to make that very clear. So Brian uses this statement in this document to argue that the virus has never been isolated or identified. However, the document doesn't say it hasn't ever been isolated or identified. The document clearly says that isolates were not available to the CDC at the time the test was created. So the CDC could have got isolates of this COVID-19 after the test was created. So then the other thing that Brian uses in this argument of his that the COVID-19 was never isolated is this CBS video. So in this CBS video, it's a nightly news broadcast by CBS, and near the end of the video, there's a reporter who's talking or who's having an interview with some Chinese diplomat. And the reporter asked the Chinese diplomat why China didn't share information earlier on. And the Chinese diplomat says this.
Is traced to a market.
It still isn't clear whether the Huanan market was the source of the virus, though outside experts believe it was a starting point for the outbreak.
Where Chinese officials took samples over a year ago.
And why has the data not been shared?
No, they didn't isolate the virus. That's the issue.
What about live animal samples?
It doesn't tell you anything if they only test positive. I do not suspect it's coming from what we originally thought.
China's government is crafting its own narrative, a patriotic film premiering today.
However, it's not that surprising that he said that, because early on, they called it a mystery virus, which means early on, China didn't isolate the virus. So maybe this Chinese diplomat guy is talking about the fact that they didn't isolate the virus up into that point. But Brian takes this, and he jumps to the conclusion that they never isolated the virus. You see, if you just Google, or do any web search if you don't want to use Google, just do a web search and type in, did they isolate COVID-19? And you'll find that there are plenty of documents claiming that they did. So I feel that Brian sharing this information the way he does is just misinforming people. It's causing people to take this information, they're going to go use this information, because people really trust Brian. They're going to use this information, and other people who don't believe this information are going to be able to easily debunk them. All they have to do is Google, just real quick. It's in the top fucking category. It's the first thing that shows up, and then those people who believe Brian are going to be laughed at, and then the people that those Brian followers were arguing with, they're going to be even more likely to believe the mainstream narrative. So Brian is doing an incredible disservice to the truth community. And now we have to ask ourselves, is he doing this intentional? I think he is. Of course, many of you know I believe Brian is a shill. And the reason why I believe Brian is doing this intentionally is because, like I said, you can disprove Brian's point by doing an easy web search. Why has Brian not done that web search? And why does Brian present this obscure information to people? This outdated information to people? So with that out of the way, what evidence do I look at to prove that there isn't a big scary virus? And it's not that there isn't a big scary virus. I'm not one of those idiots who says viruses don't exist. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that this virus that is out there is not even nearly as deadly as they're making it out to be. So what evidence do I look at? Well, from the beginning, before the scam even made its way to the States, I looked at the supposed deaths caused by the virus coming out of China. In my first video about the subject, way back in January of 2020, which was removed by YouTube and which gave me a terms of service strike, of course, I looked at the people who were supposedly dying on the streets of China and showed that these people were not dead and were very likely surrounded by government agents dressed in all black. My follow-up to that video, I have another video which is titled, I believe it's titled, COVID-19, does this look serious, or does this look deadly, or whatever. And in that video, I proved, or at least my suspicion was confirmed, that these guys who were dressed in all black were indeed government agents. So after that video, after that initial video, when this virus came to the States, I looked at videos of the government admitting that they're counting the deaths differently. Videos like this one.
Of people dying of COVID. So the case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that if, technically, even if you died of clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
And videos like this one.
Other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? I mean, you hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews the data that you're trying to collect in terms of projections and things?
Which I will say, Brian has looked at the way that they count deaths too. He has criticized the way that they're reporting the deaths. But that's expected of a shill, because shills will always mix some truth in with their lies. And we know this because of Alex Jones. If you guys don't think that Alex Jones is a shill, then I don't know what to tell you. Then after those videos, I looked at this video by Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, which I recommend other people watch as well. And then after that, I learned about how the PCR test works from its inventor, Dr. Kary Mullis, to understand how many of the people who tested positive could have been false positives. So those are some areas where you can prove that this virus isn't so deadly without having to stumble across false information. So with that said, with that out of the way, let me now share with you guys why they're pulling this narrative out of the bag now. Now, they're pulling the narrative out of the bag for two reasons. The first reason is because people are catching on to the fact that this virus isn't as deadly as they were led to believe. For example, we have this county in Northern California that reduced its COVID-19 fatality figure by 25% by changing the way they count COVID-19 deaths. I guess they stopped counting every death as a COVID-19 death. That will definitely reduce the figure by at least 25%. Now, the main reason why they're pulling this narrative out of the bag, or at least the main reason that they pulled the narrative out of the bag, because they already put the narrative back in the bag, but the main reason why they pulled it out of the bag was because they're trying to vaccinate children now. You see, it's pretty interesting. Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart, they kind of are watched by a younger audience, or at least like a relatively young audience. I'd say that the audience that watches Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, they probably have young children now. Like the people who were fanboys of them when they were younger, they grew up, they probably have kids now. And that Stephen Colbert show, a lot of people, actually, I don't think I've heard anybody mention it. That was actually the first live guest that Stephen Colbert had since the lockdown. So it was actually a relatively big episode. They knew they were going to have a lot of viewers. And they knew who the viewers of that episode were going to be. And I believe, I'll say again, that they did the whole thing because they know they're trying to vaccinate young people, and they know even if they debunk the narrative after that, as I said earlier on in this video, it doesn't matter if a person subscribes to the lab leak theory narrative or not. Simply talking about the lab leak theory is enough to get people to think that there really is a novel virus out there that requires these novel actions, that require these extreme measures to deal with, including vaccinating fucking everybody and locking people down. Anyway, I'm going to end the video here. I'll see you fellow slaves in the next video, which I will try very hard to get out sooner rather than later.